Hi there, I'm Andrew Egger, White House correspondent for the Bulwark and author of our Morning Shots newsletter with Bill Kristol. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been making the rounds on Capitol Hill the last couple of weeks. Republican senators are mostly saying they like what they hear. So here was Senator John Thune, the incoming majority leader last week, speaking about RFK Jr. I think he's done a good job of answering a lot of the questions about his views on vaccines. I think he understands the values and benefit that vaccines play and have played through the years preventing disease. This is kind of a remarkable thing to say about a person who has dedicated decades of his life to a public war against pediatric vaccinations. He's argued constantly that the shots we all give our kids do more harm than good. If I started laundry listing things he's said or written or stuff in videos he's produced about that effect, we would be here literally all day. But it's also what Thune says there is also kind of in keeping with how RFK Jr. describes his own vaccination position, because he argues that he is not anti-vaccine per se. What he is in favor of is more strenuous vaccine safety. He argues that the vaccines that we currently use have not, in his view, been adequately tested, that their approval process was not rigorous enough to satisfy him and other advocates like him. So I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit, to break down what he means by that. You know, what the current vaccine approval process looks like, why we use the process that we currently use, and what might look different about it if RFK Jr. is actually confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services in January. So I'm joined today, I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Paul Offit. He's a pediatrician and a virologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's the co-inventor of the pediatric rotavirus vaccine that's in use today, and he serves on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. Always love talking to him. Thank you, Dr. Offit, for joining me.
My pleasure.
So you've written a little bit about this very thing over the years, this very question of, why is the vaccine approval process that's currently been stood up, the one that RFK Jr. attacks, he specifically goes after, the question of, should we be testing these things more strenuously? Can you just talk a little bit about when a vaccine, such as the one that you invented, when that goes to the FDA and they need to make recommendations for whether it's going to be approved, what does that look like? What are the safety testings that have already been done at that point?
Right. So the way this process works is usually you do preclinical studies initially, which is to say studies in experimental animals to show that you can potentially at least make a vaccine in mammals. But again, mice lie and monkeys exaggerate, so you never know till you get to people. And then you do phase 1 studies, which is to say you want to do proof of concept studies. Do you need to have all the strains in that vaccine as you think might need to be there? So rotavirus, for example, is a multi-strain infection. There's a lot of different serotypes out there. How many do you need to put in there? At what quantity? So you do dose ranging studies. Do you have the right buffering agent, the right stabilizing agent, the right vial? And when you think you have that in phase 1 studies, then you go to phase 2 studies. You think you've got the vaccine. You think you know how many doses you need to give. You think you have the right amount of antigen in there. The actual vaccine component, you think you have the right number of serotypes. Then you go to phase 2, where you look at hundreds of people, which is a safety study to make sure you don't have any common safety side effect. So now you're feeling good. You've got a vaccine that looks like it works. It induces an immune response that's protective. It appears to be safe as far as hundreds of people inoculated are concerned. Then you go to the big phase 3 trial, which, for example, with rotavirus was a 70,000 person prospective placebo-controlled 4-year, 11 country, probably $350 million trial to prove that the vaccine works. And that's the only way you can know that is with a placebo, and to prove that it's safe, at least safe to the extent that you can say it doesn't cause an uncommon serious side effect. And then it's licensed and given to not a million, but millions, and then tens of millions, and then more. So the rotavirus vaccine has been given to billions of children in the world. But you're not done with safety testing, because then you have the most important safety test, which is the vaccine safety data link. So as the vaccine rolls out into this country, there are about 12 million people who are linked through this computerized medical record system, because some people get a vaccine, some people don't, right? The whole country doesn't get vaccinated initially. Some people get the vaccine, some don't. So this gives you a chance to see whether or not there's a problem. I think there's probably no better example than the COVID vaccines. I mean, when the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, met in December of 2020 to discuss the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, I mean, those vaccines have been given to 35,000 people total, right? 20,000 for Pfizer, 15,000 for Moderna. So 35,000 people had gotten that vaccine. but you're about to make a recommendation for hundreds of millions of people. So you know the other shoe is going to drop. You know there may be a rare side effect, and you need a system to pick that up. And so that is the vaccine safety data link, which picked it up, right? For the mRNA vaccines, myocarditis, this inflammation of the heart muscle, which fortunately was transient and self-resolving, occurred in 1 in 50,000 people. You're not going to pick that up in pre-licensure studies, only in these post-licensure surveillance systems. Look at the J&J vaccine, the vectored adenovirus vaccine. So released in February of 2021, that was found to be a cause of clotting in 1 in 250,000 people. I mean, there's no hiding. When people say, pharmaceutical companies may misrepresent data or omit data or mislead the public, there is no hiding from the vaccine safety data link. If there's a problem, it'll be picked up. So what RFK Jr. means when he says there needs to be more transparency, or what he means when he says there needs to be better safety studies, what he means by that is that all the safety studies that have been done don't comport with his preconceived, fixed, non-falsifiable hypothesis that vaccine cause problems like autism. So when study after study shows that it doesn't cause autism, he says, well, the system's rigged. This must be wrong. We need to really do the real kind of safety studies, meaning the one that show that my non-falsifiable hypothesis is correct. That's what he really means.
Yeah. So I want to drill down on this a little bit, because it's one thing, right, for this guy to have just sort of these notions about vaccines floating around in his head. It's another thing to kind of think about what it might actually look like if he were confirmed, in terms of the approvals that already exist, and in terms of what kind of new regulatory barriers he might put up for new products that might be coming onto the market. And I think one thing that's been so striking to me, and one thing that you've written about a little bit, is specifically this question that every single new product that comes to the market should have this lengthy placebo-controlled test in particular, right? And where this gets dicey is when you're talking about products that exist to combat a disease that already has a vaccine potentially, right? And so you wrote a piece last year called "The Casual Cruelty of Placebo-Controlled Trials," which is kind of like a striking headline, right? Because as RFK Jr. likes to say, shouldn't we want placebo-controlled trials for every new product and things like that? So can you talk a little bit about what you were talking about in that piece, and what kind of ethical considerations confront people who are developing a vaccine for maybe a product where a vaccine already exists?
Right. So take pneumococcus, for example. So that's a bacteria that causes sepsis, meaning bloodstream infections, causes pneumonia, causes meningitis, and causes a lot of hospitalization and suffering and death in this country prior to a vaccine. So the first vaccine that worked well for young children was called PCV7. So that contained 7 of the 92 serotypes that cause pneumococcal infection. 7 prominent ones. And it worked. And it started to reduce the incidence of invasive pneumococcal infection, reduce the incidence of meningitis and sepsis. Then there was a decision made by another company to let's increase the number of serotypes to 13. Eventually we had 15, then we had 20, then we had 21, as we try and cover in more and more of the bacterial strains that are causing disease. So when PCV13 came onto the market, you can't test it against placebo because you know that you have a product that works. That's not just dicey. That's just unethical. You can't have a placebo group where you know they're not going to be protected against pneumococcus to show that PCV13 works. You have to have PCV7 as the control, and then show that this PCV13, this pneumococcal vaccine that has more serotypes, is at least as good, if not better, the so-called non-inferiority rule. You have to show that it is at least as good, if not better. You can't do a placebo-controlled trial. It's unethical, and no institution in this world would allow it to happen.
Yeah, and I just want to drill down on that point, because essentially what you're saying, and this is not something I had considered before I read your piece. I thought it was really interesting. I mean, when you are first developing, when they developed that original vaccine that combated 7 strains, as you say, there's no problem with running a placebo-controlled trial there, because you need to test this product and get it onto the market, and there isn't anything giving coverage. So the question is, the kids who get the placebo shot, right? Are you actively harming them by giving them a placebo shot? And the answer obviously is no, if there's no product that could be giving them coverage already on the market, right? But when it comes to updating that shot, when it comes to making that shot better, then you have a real ethical problem. If you are now talking about actively withholding the shot that already works pretty well from these kids, and instead giving them a placebo just so you can test the effectiveness of a hopefully better shot that comes later, because kids who get that placebo might get sick, might even die. And I think we really ought to drill down on this, because this is essentially what RFK Jr. has said should be now retroactively done for every single pediatric vaccine that's currently on the market, right? So can you just talk a little bit about what that would look like if you got a Secretary of Health and Human Services in there who now kind of retroactively wanted to go back and do placebo-controlled trials on essentially every vaccine we currently give kids?
I think he would never be able to do that. I mean, there's no institution that would agree with that at all. I'm going to sort of take it a step further, and this may surprise you. I think you could argue that the COVID vaccine shouldn't have been subjected to a placebo-controlled trial. And here's why. You knew that the mRNA vaccines were novel. We had never used that technology to make a vaccine before. So we didn't know much, and we needed to know more. However, there was an mRNA vaccine that was developed for SARS-1. It was developed at the National Institutes of Health by Barney Graham and Kizzy Corbett and others. So you had a lot of data, at least on the research side. And you had some data clinically to know that it could induce an immune response that was likely be protective. So now you have a virus in this country that is killing hundreds or thousands of people a day. What you could argue for doing is to just give the vaccine as much as you can, and then to as many people as you can, knowing that not everybody's going to get it. There will be some who get it and some who don't get it. And then you can see whether or not it works in retrospect and whether or not it's safe in retrospect. It's essentially what happened with the Ebola outbreak. With the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, there was a decision by companies to make this novel vaccine. It was so-called vesicular stomatitis virus vaccine, into which was cloned the gene that coded for the Ebola virus surface protein. There wasn't any data on that, but they didn't do a placebo-controlled trial. This virus was killing hundreds and thousands of people in West Africa, so they just rolled it out. Some people got it, some people didn't, because not everybody could get it at once. And then you saw in retrospect that it was quite effective and safe. Because think about this. I mean, I had a friend in North Carolina who volunteered for the Moderna trial. And he wakes up the next morning, he got a shot, he doesn't know what he's gotten. And he has sort of headache and fever and muscle ache. And he looks at his wife and he says, "Yes, I got the vaccine." Right? I mean, that's why they volunteer for the trial, because they were hoping to get the vaccine. I mean, you could argue that when hundreds or thousands of people are dying a day, you can still get a lot of information by just rolling the vaccine out, which is what we did with Ebola in West Africa. Why not do that with COVID here? So, however, in terms of like going back in time and doing placebo-controlled trials, first of all, they virtually all were placebo-controlled trials. I mean, I know that this lawyer named Aaron Siri, who is a lawyer who works with the Informed Consent Action Network and does everything he can to put bad information out there to confuse people and make them scared of vaccines. I mean, he has talked about how he thinks that the polio vaccine should be with a placebo-controlled trial. And the thinking is just nonsensical. It's the way, here's how you make a polio vaccine. Take the virus, grow it up in cells, usually African green monkey kidney cells, purify the virus away from those cells, kill it with formaldehyde. That's the way the vaccine was made by Jonas Salk in 1955. It's the way the vaccine is made today. Now, the Salk vaccine was made in 1955. This is like 70 years ago, right? So we have had in the last 70 years advances in protein chemistry and protein purification. So it's not exactly the same vaccine, but it's made exactly the same way. It's just made growing poliovirus in cells, purifying it, killing with formaldehyde. So it's the same technology. It's not like it's the mRNA polio vaccine, which you could argue should be tested against, the current vaccine. But to do a placebo-controlled trial, because this vaccine, which is probably a little purer, although no more safe, they're both safe. You can't do that trial. And here's why you can't do that trial. You can't do that trial because polio is still around. I mean, there was that case in Rockland County, New York in 2022 of a 27-year-old man who never left this country who got polio caused by one of these revertant strains, type 2 strains that was in the original oral polio vaccine by Albert Sabin. It's the same strain that's causing problems in Gaza, right? So just give placebo. And when you get paralyzed by polio, it's the tip of an iceberg. because only 1 of 200 people who are infected with polio will be paralyzed. So he was the tip of a much bigger iceberg, which was proven by finding this strain in wastewater samples, not only in his county, but in surrounding counties. And if you look in Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles, you'll see those same strains. Drop immunization rates against polio, which is what happened in this man's county. It dropped to less than 30%. Polio comes back. And that would be true here too. You can't ethically do that placebo trial. What this lawyer said, this Aaron Siri said was, well, there's other combination products that contain the inactivated polio vaccine. You can still use those, which makes no sense. If you think the inactivated polio vaccine currently given today, which is given as both a standalone vaccine and also as a part of this sort of compound vaccines. Why is it not safe as a standalone, but it's safe when it's in these compounded vaccines? I mean, he just keeps backtracking. And I will say this, they stepped on a third rail when they picked on polio. They did. Mitch McConnell immediately stepped up and said, wait a second, because he had polio as a child. Donald Trump, who was born in 1946, 10 years before there was a vaccine, said, wait a second, for that vaccine, you're going to have to push me really hard. I was in a polio ward when I was 5 years of age. Anybody who's older remembers polio and remembers that was the single disease about which parents were most scared. When you stepped on the third rail with polio, you made a mistake. And that's why he just kept backtracking, Aaron Siri, because he knew he had made a mistake. And I think they knew they'd made a mistake.
Yeah, the most striking anecdote in your piece that I was quoting from earlier was about sort of the rollout of Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, and I just want to read a little bit of it here because this is what you write. In 1954, 420,000 first and second graders in the United States were inoculated with Jonas Salk's inactivated polio vaccine. 200,000 were inoculated with salt water. It was one of the largest placebo-controlled trials of a medical product in history. Jonas Salk didn't want to do it. He couldn't conscience giving a saltwater shot to young children when as many as 50,000 were paralyzed by polio and 1,500 died every year. When the trial was over, the vaccine was declared safe, effective, and potent. Church bells rang out, synagogues held special prayer meetings, department store patrons stopped to listen to the result of the trial over loudspeakers. How did we know that Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was effective? We know because 16 children died from polio in that study, all in the placebo group. We know because 34 of the 36 children paralyzed by polio in that study were in the placebo group. These are the gentle heroes we leave behind. I just wanted to ask you about that because I do wonder if a big part of the kind of like burgeoning anti-vaccine energy that we see now in a lot of places, but kind of encapsulated by RFK Jr. It's because there's this kind of perception that well, we look around and we're not seeing this disease around, right? And so do we really need to kind of put this stuff in our our healthy kid who's healthy now when we're not looking around and we're seeing people dying from polio? It seems like the kind of the hidden cost of not vaccinating is out of our view. Do you worry that we might kind of need a real kick in the teeth in that kind of way as our country before we can kind of get rattled back into okay, actually, no, it turns out these vaccinations are really good and useful after all?
No, you're exactly right. I mean, if you take polio as an example, it's not just that we've largely eliminated polio from the United States, it's that we've eliminated the memory of polio. I think the same thing's true for measles. I think we eliminated measles from the United States by the year 2000. I mean, it's starting to come back in large part because parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children, or a critical percentage of parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children. So we went from 4 outbreaks and 50 cases last year to 16 outbreaks and 250 cases this year. Get to a few thousand cases of measles, and you'll start to see children die of measles again in this country. It has a mortality rate of 0.1%, so 1 out of every 1,000 children will die. And people don't remember measles. When a child comes into our emergency department at Children's Hospital Philadelphia with fever and a rash, they'll often call old people like me down to the emergency department to watch. I can tell whether somebody has measles in 30 seconds. They're sick. They're photophobic, meaning they're intolerant to light. They're looking down. They invariably have abnormal chest x-rays. Whether they have pneumonia or not, they'll at least have an abnormal chest x-ray. Before there was a measles vaccine every year in this country, 3 to 4 million children would get measles. I'm a child of the 50s. I had measles. About 48,000 would be hospitalized, 500 would die, and 1,000 would get encephalitis, meaning inflammation of the brain, of whom a quarter would develop permanent brain damage. Measles was a nightmare, and I think people don't remember measles. Also, it's a nightmare for hospitals because you don't want measles in your hospital. You don't. It's a highly contagious disease. It's an airspace disease. And so if it's in your hospital, I don't care how good your infection control people are, you just have to be in the airspace of someone who has measles to catch it. And so when I was training, and certainly I remember even when I was in Baltimore, and training in medical school, there was a huge polio outbreak in North Baltimore, and you only wanted to admit children who had severe dehydration that required intravenous fluids, or had severe pneumonia that required oxygen and respiratory support. The others you wanted out of the hospital. Now, we had an outbreak in Philadelphia like last year, and they admitted a couple of children to the hospital that would never have gotten admitted otherwise, because our young doctors have never seen this virus before. And when they see it, they say, oh my God, let's bring this child into the hospital. A mistake. I'll give you a perfect example. This is probably more than you want, but just one example. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but it tells you how contagious this virus is. There was a 17-year-old girl, part of a church group, although it wasn't a fundamentalist group. They believed in vaccination. Goes to Romania, visits an orphanage, visits a hospital, comes back to a church picnic of 500 people. Now, she's infected with measles and she's shedding the virus. She doesn't know that, because usually you're most contagious right before you start to get sick. Same thing's true with COVID. So she visits it for 2 hours. She's in a church picnic with 500 people. Now, most people have been vaccinated or naturally infected, with the exception of 35. 35 people had never been naturally infected or vaccinated. Of those 35, 31 got measles. 31 of 35. She was only there for 2 hours. There were 500 people there. You only had to be in her airspace. People don't realize how contagious this is. But I hope you're wrong. I mean, I hope what doesn't have to happen is this disease comes back for us to realize how critical it is, how important it is to protect against it. I remember Maurice Hilleman is really the inventor of the current measles vaccine, which was introduced in 1968 in this country, which he calls the more attenuated Ender strain, the Morton strain. Same strain we've been using since 68. Maurice Hilleman invented it. In the last 6 months of his life, he died in 2005, he was starting to see measles come back. And I remember in interviewing him, I asked him, do you think we can educate people to tell them how important this virus is, so that and how deadly this disease can be, in order for people to realize they need to vaccinate kids? And he spent a long time answering that question. He said, no, I think the disease has to come back for people to realize how important it is. And only fear appears to sell.
Yeah, I guess we're going to find out. Hopefully we won't have to find out. Let's put it that way. The one thing I guess I would additionally ask, thanks for giving me all this time. You mentioned RFK Jr. plainly would like to see real kind of like stringent placebo-controlled trials done now retroactively for a bunch of products that are already on the market. You suggested there would not even likely be an institution that would be willing to run those trials for him. Can you just talk a little bit more about like what that kind of friction would look like between having a guy, who has these anti-vaccine beliefs running Health and Human Services, and then you have all of these medical institutions and these institutions that do these tests, that you'd then have, conflicts that I would assume go beyond that, between Health and Human Services on the one hand, and then kind of the medical community on the other hand. What are some things that might look like, just to cast yourself forward into a world where RFK Jr. is running Health and Human Services in the next administration?
If he really wanted to hurt vaccines, he could do the following. One is he could weaken or eliminate the Vaccine for Children's program, which is congressionally approved. So he would have to do it through Congress, I think, unless there was some way to make this an executive order. The Vaccine for Children's program was born in the Clinton administration. It purchases 50 to 55% of all vaccines in the United States for those who are uninsured or underinsured. That would really decrease immunization rates in this country. Or he could basically say, I'm going to take certain vaccines out of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, so they're no longer protected by the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. I think these vaccines may be unsafe. Let's just leave them to the slings and arrows of outrageous civil litigation. And then what will happen is just what happened in the early 1980s. Companies will stop making these vaccines. And that's why the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act was born in 1986, to at least provide some sort of firewall, initial firewall, so that these companies would still make vaccines for American children. We were about to not have a pertussis or whooping cough vaccine for American children because of all that litigation. So take that litigation protection away, and you can really hurt vaccines. But I would say one thing about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It is amazing to me we're talking about him as head of a Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, everybody knows, for example, that he is said on podcasts that no vaccine is a benefit, or that the polio vaccine killed many, many, many more people than it saved, or that, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, the COVID vaccines, is the most dangerous vaccine ever made. Most people probably know that he doesn't think HIV is the cause of AIDS, and that he thinks that it was caused either by poppers, these so-called amyl nitrites, a recreational sex drug, or that it was caused by AZT, zidovudine, an antiretroviral drug. He calls AZT mass murder. He calls AZT mass murder. And if you really want to scare yourself, you should read his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. Because you will learn, if you read pages 285 to 291, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. does not believe in the germ theory. Right, the germ theory. I don't know if there are particular criteria for being head of HHS, but belief in the germ theory, I would have to believe, is one. Rather, he believes in the miasma theory, which is sort of popular in Europe in the 1700s. That basically through things like rotting carcasses and poor sanitation and hygiene, that there's kind of this bad air that comes out and that wafts around, and that if you're immune compromised or you're not in good health, that then you get infected. So that's why he's against pasteurization, because he doesn't believe in the germ theory. That's why he's against vaccines, because he doesn't believe in the germ theory. He thinks that pasteurization and vaccination has only hurt us, because those are both sort of intoxications in a sense. I can't believe we're having this discussion, is what I'm saying. I can't believe that John Thune or anybody comes out and says, there's something to this guy. And although I'm sure he's right about certain things, like I think the ultra processed foods are probably not good. I think we aren't very good about dieting or exercising, and certainly we're overweight as a society, and we have a high level of type 2 diabetes. I get all that, but good Lord, I mean, he's a science denialist. He's not a skeptic. I wish they'd stop saying he's a vaccine skeptic. He's a science denialist. He doesn't think HIV causes AIDS. He doesn't believe in the germ theory, which is not a theory. It's like a fact. Specific germs do cause specific diseases. He thinks that preventing and treating those germs has led us to have a high level of chronic disease. That treating or preventing germs has caused us to have a high level of chronic diseases, which is why he drinks raw milk and why he eschews any sort of level of vaccination.
Well, we're going to see whether he gets through, right? It'll be an interesting few weeks when we all come back from the holidays. Dr. Offit, we can leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on to talk all this stuff through with me. Always appreciate talking to you.
My pleasure.
And to everybody who has been listening to us, thanks for joining us. Please do like and subscribe, as we YouTubers like to say, and head on over to thebulwark.com to sign up for everything else that we're doing. Thanks a lot. See you soon.